Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Crimes and Times. Tonight, we're going to talk about a subject that mystifies us: why good people do bad things. And we're going to be joined by a journalist who is doing a documentary on a very specific story. First, let me introduce our co-host, Joel Nichols. Joel, thank you for joining us as always.
It's always a pleasure. This is going to be fascinating. Our guest this time around he's been a reporter from coast to coast, basically, and he's been a documentarian the last few years and telling great stories. This one is particularly interesting because it touches on so many things that are important to our society, like, fame and fortune and success, and also more Kansas City-wide, somebody who was affiliated with a team that means increasingly a lot to us as a community. It's a fascinating story, and you're right. It's about what happens when things seem to go horribly, tragically wrong.
All right, thank you. So, Kevin Allen, journalist, you are working on a documentary on a story that actually is kind of timely, as Joel said, in a couple of ways, especially here in Kansas City, but this affects the entire country, if not the world. Welcome, and please tell us about your story.
Yeah, it's good to be with you guys. So the story is about a Kansas City Chief who won a Super Bowl with the Chiefs, the last iteration in 69-70, was a 9-time Pro Bowler, was the offensive lineman of the year. The accolades go on and on. This is a guy who was a shoo-in for the Hall of Fame on the first ballot, but in many ways has been forgotten because of the concluding events of his life. His name is Jim Tyrer. Jim was a huge man, bigger than life in physical and in other ways as well. About 6'7", 295 at a time when, the NFL players didn't run that big. The big guys in the NFL would look at Jim and say, "Oh my God." So you didn't want to face Jim, but he was known as much on the field, as good as he was on the field. He was known as just being a real gregarious, approachable guy. It wasn't known to even go out and drink with the guys very often. He would make excuses to instead be with his family. He was, if somebody approached him in a restaurant, for example, and wanted an autograph, he would, be amiable. He wouldn't shoo people away. And it was known as a great father, had 4 kids, great teammate. And so when his life came to an end, everybody was just shocked. And the way it came to an end was just beyond comprehension.
Kevin, I just have to make a note that you talk about the size of these guys. And we see them on TV. We see they're big and strong. Well, I was a police officer in 1980 to 83 down in Fairfax County, Virginia, right outside of D.C., so on the border. So it wouldn't be unusual for us to have an interaction with one of the home team Redskins. And when you stop them, in the car and you look at their license and you see the size, 6'9", 300 pounds, you're like, don't get out of this car, please. Or, you confront them personally, like send me like 9 guys for backup if there's a problem. I'm not saying there always was. Because the average person, you just can't imagine when you're confronting that you might have a physical altercation with someone of that size, just how intimidating that can be.
Right. And, you say that, and it makes me think of the teammates of Jim Tyrer that I've interviewed. Of course, you always begin with a handshake. And for a guy like me, average size guy, I feel myself trying to inflate my hand or make it more muscular and rugged. I've talked with, Fred Arban. Fred Arbanis was a tight end for the Chiefs. He is still, a big fella, and his hand is calloused and large. And Ed Lothamer and Ed Buddy, and to talk to these guys who are huge figures and have them say, I wasn't big compared to Jim. It is amazing.
Well, and that, you go back 50 years, because I know that some of the Chiefs from 50 years ago much better than I know the current crop of Chiefs. Right. And these are guys they're bigger than the rest of us, but they're not this kind of gargantuan presence in a lot of ways. They are a presence because of what they've accomplished and who they are, but physically. So when you take somebody like Jim Tyrer, who towers over those people, That's a pretty intimidating situation. But then you say that as a person, he was kind of a gentle, outgoing, friendly guy.
Right. So he had 4 kids, and I've talked to them all, some of them more in depth than others, and they talk about in the house that mom was the strong one. She was the disciplinarian.
Right.
That you know, spanking was very common during that time, and dad did never spank. If you were going to get paddled, it was mom who did it, and they speculated that he was aware of how big he was, that he just wouldn't even put himself in the situation of spanking the kids.
Right.
But the thing I thought about when I was talking to these teammates about how big he is that he could have played today.
Right.
You know,
Right.
6'7", 295 is a reasonable size to play today. And I asked them that, and they said, yeah, you know, that's not true of everybody of that generation, but it certainly was true of Tyrer, that he was one of these abnormal guys in that you could be that big and still be quick. I mean, there's nothing more scary than a huge man that is nimble and fast on his feet. And I chuckle because there was a newspaper article that I looked at yesterday in which they asked Ben Davidson of the Oakland Raiders, who was also just a fearsome guy at that time, who did you most not want to play against? And he said Jim Tyrer. And what he said was that when he had his head down coming at you, it looked like a giant red garbage can was being thrown at you. And that he was not only huge, but his noggin was large as well. So, and that's what you led with back then.
Right. I was just going to ask you, you know, that the fact of his head being so huge, thinking of the rules back then versus now, many people, including myself, weren't aware of that difference. You know, I'm not a huge follower of this, you know, sports and rules. Can you explain to our audience what exactly we're discussing?
Yeah. So for one thing, think back to the playing cards that you used to see for football players, and a lot of times they're like this.
Right.
You know, you don't see that anymore. Well, the reason the guys were like this is because an offensive lineman in that time, you could not extend your arms. That was part of the rules. You could not use your hands. Now, granted, you still can't grasp with your hands, but you can extend and protect yourself. So imagine these people coming at you, and as an offensive lineman, you have your hands like this, have to keep them up. What is it you're going to use? You use your head. You use your head on every play. And so you lean forward, and you lean with your head. And you know, it's that's what even kids were taught early on of that generation, is your helmet is your weapon. So lead with that head. And that's what he did for 180 consecutive games starting. And his career lasted 14 years.
And with equipment that's not like it is today.
Oh my gosh.
It's a totally different thing.
Yeah, but let me ask you two guys, just as observers, and I, again, not being a huge sports fan, and I know we always have the benefit of hindsight, but even thinking those many years ago, doesn't the idea of lead with your head just sound a little dangerous in so many respects, even irrespective of what we know now about CTE? I can think of so many ways that could go wrong. I'm having a hard time, you know, reconciling that was the way we taught people to play.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in hindsight, it sure does seem that way. I guess a lot of things in hindsight seem odd, you know. But you know, we've got MMA, UFC now, where guys are wailing on each other, and that's at a fever pitch of interest. And I think particularly then, you know, if you got your nose broken on a given play, and you felt it just like you and I would feel it today, but you also knew in your mind that if I don't get back out there, somebody else is going to get back out there. And you know, that line between being cut loose and staying on the team was much finer back then than it is now. You know, if a team has a guaranteed millions of dollars invested in you, they're going to lose that money if they cut you loose. You know, I mean, at a certain point, maybe they'll still do it, but it's not going to be a couple of plays that make that difference.
When 50 years ago, the investment was nothing like that. And most of these people of that era, they were working other jobs. Certainly in the off season, they were working other jobs. And I mean, legendary people where I grew up in Wisconsin, you know, Nitschke and Starr and these legendary players. And I know Len Dawson here locally. He was a sportscaster at Channel 9 while he was the quarterback of the Super Bowl winning Chiefs. So they're working other jobs. So the financial aspect of this for Jim Tyrer is that if I don't go back and play, they're going to get somebody else they'll put in there, and you know, that's that.
Right. I talked with a lot of these guys who were telling me about the side jobs that they worked. You know, let's say, and this is a reasonable number, you work for $15,000 a year and you're a star football player. You know, even in the 60s, that's not rolling in it.
Right.
Right.
And you know, Ed Lothamer, who played both sides of the ball and was a well-known chief of that time, he talked about owning some different bars or running some bars and getting into that business and sitting on the bench between you know, plays and or whatever, maybe it was a timeout, and somebody hollered to him from the crowd, "Hey, Ed, come here." And he goes over to the crowd, and the guy hands him a gin and tonic. He goes and sits back down with his gin and tonic in his hand, and then he thought, this is probably not a good idea.
But Dawson was probably sitting next to him on the bench smoking a cigarette like that.
There you go.
Picture, so.
You beat me to it, you know. Hey.
So Kevin, there's a lot of stories these days, you know, about CTE, about some very famous athletes committing some horrendous acts. We know about that. What attracted you to this particular story?
Well, as Joel knows, I'm always poking around. I'm always curious about it. I believe that everybody has a story, and there is a woman in Lenexa who manages her own salon and cuts hair. And I was impressed by the way she cut my wife's hair. She's always listening to people. She's like a psychiatrist with clippers, you know? Mm-hmm. And over time, as we got to know her, she said, you know, my dad used to play for the Chiefs. And then that's all she said. And, you know, where are your parents now? They were in an accident. And so you let it go. And then as years went on, we got to know her a little bit and found out her dad is Jim Tyrer. And it's no coincidence that she's a good listener and that she's able to kind of help people through things, because she went through tragedy herself. And then I got to, you know, reaching out to her three siblings and to discover what they had been through, and that all four of them are successful, amiable, good people, blew me away. I was like, how do you pull that off? How do you go through what you went through and be the kind of people that you are? And once there's a story of resilience or endurance that's in front of me, I just find that fascinating.
All right, so Kevin, actually, I want to ask you a question because Joel and I did another show having to do with suicide and surviving that. But let's tell the audience what exactly did happen to Jim Tyrer. We haven't gotten to what makes this the story.
Right. So on September 15th, the day before the Chiefs had played the Seahawks and the Seahawks had beat the Chiefs, Jim Tyrer was retired at that point. Takes his 10-year-old son to that football game, and he just doesn't seem himself. He is always a good father, but he's telling his son Jason more things like, "I love you so much, I'm proud of you," hugging on him, kissing his head. This was not the normal Jim to be just real lovey-dovey. And other people noticed that as well. And so that night, the tired children, 10, 11, and 17, go to sleep. The 19-year-old is a freshman at Mizzou. And in the middle of the night, they're jarred awake by the sound of a gunshot. Then a woman screams, sound of another gunshot. And then a little bit of time passes, maybe 5 seconds. And what the eldest son calls a primeval scream, which was Tyrer, and a final gunshot, and sound of a huge body falling to the floor. So across the course of that night, the kids hid under their bed. They thought it was an intruder. They waited, and eventually the 11-year-old daughter goes in and discovers they're not responsive. So Jim Tyrer took his wife's life, and then he took his own. And that was September 15th, 1980. And it blew everybody away at the time. I mean, it was just, it's not just that it was a horrible tragedy, but I'm trying to think of somebody of this time that if they did a similar thing, we could equate it. It just wasn't the guy to have done something like that.
When did he retire from the Chiefs?
It would have been, I think, 1974.
So those 6 years between 74 and 80, when this horrific thing occurs, what was his life like? Had he found, some players find new success as an agent, or they have a restaurant, or they become a sportscaster. Some players struggle a lot because there's nothing they can do off the field that fulfills them the way what they did on the field. So what were those 6 years like for him between the end of his football career, which was stellar, and this terrible night?
Right. Yeah. One of his teammates told me that he felt like Jim had not ever experienced failure before. And that going into the business world, he had early success and was as successful as a businessman as he had been as a football player. And then you get into the late 70s and this doesn't work and this doesn't work. And I think about the context of that period of time. Late 70s was not a good economic time, so he started to take that upon himself. He felt like he wasn't, providing, and he was starting to just really feel despondent. Didn't have that kind of success anymore, and so there are those that say that was the reason he did what he did. We do know. I've been finding things that weren't in articles then, things that have never been released. And I think part of that is because enough time has passed that people are more open. Think about the kids being, the youngest two being 10 and 11. Even the TMZs of the world wouldn't approach the kids at that time, but they definitely had information. What I found is that Martha, the wife, had decided that she would look for a job. And that was devastating to Jim. We know that there was a dress that was hung in the Tyrer's bedroom and that she had a job interview the next morning.
And that was a sign of failure to him personally, that for a man of his generation and for that time for him, that would have been a sign that he somehow has failed that family, right?
Right.
Kevin,
right.
Did he leave a suicide note or any indications? Did you find anyone that he had spoken to where, again, in hindsight, we might have seen those red flags?
Right. He didn't leave a suicide note, but just even last week, I spoke with a teammate who said he had talked to him 2, maybe 3 days before. And in retrospect, Jim was trying to reach out to him. And the friend just didn't see it. And you can tell the friend had regret, wish that he'd engaged him more. But I said, well, why do you think Jim was trying to reach out to you? So because he came all the way to KCK where I worked. That wasn't convenient for him. He didn't just drop by the way he did. And there just wasn't a real purpose for the meeting. And this friend, also a teammate, he had been real successful. So he could see that Jim needed the financial help, but just couldn't quite broach the subject.
You know, I have to share a personal story. I'm sorry, Joe, excuse me. Many years ago, my closest friend at the time was very depressed, going through a divorce. And I spoke to him, and my wife also spoke to him. We invited him to come and stay with us just for a few days to get over that hump. And he didn't do it. He said, "No, I'm all right. I don't need to do it." And we asked him again, and you can only push the issue so many times. And only a few days later, he committed suicide. And excuse me while I'm getting the chills right now as I speak about it. It was many years ago, but that frustration, I guess, somewhat guilt. I always think, could we have pushed more? What more could we have done? I certainly didn't sense suicide on the horizon, other than he's being down and out. You just don't see it in your friends, someone you know, someone you're close to, and I understand what that guy's going through. Especially if he feels there were red flags, you just feel, what else could I have done to save my friend? And I got to tell you, it's a feeling that's haunted me for many, many years.
Mm-hmm. And he wasn't the only teammate that said that either. And I don't, you wish you had more of a window into what exactly someone is going through. Because people, you hear it all the time, don't you? Where he didn't look like blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Well, what exactly does that look like?
Well, that goes almost to something else that we discuss here in the show when we talk about the mass shooters who are usually suicidal at the same time. And here, Jim Tyrer took someone else's life. He wasn't the mass shooter as we know it now, but still took an innocent person's life. And we always say in hindsight, oh, look at all these red flags. But yeah, exactly. He didn't look like it and I didn't see it because it's so hard to see if we even can see it. And
right.
Even when I've had on the show mental health experts to talk to most of the mass shooting incidents, they always say, even if we had talked to that person the day before, we probably would not have diagnosed them with any sort of a disease or condition that would warrant, involuntary confinement. And even if we predicted that he might turn into a shooter, we don't know when that would have happened or if that would have happened ever. And so you're right. We can say, what does he look like? We just don't know yet. Unfortunately, we don't have that very specific profile that could rely on and do anything about.
Right. And my background, my dad was a chaplain of a Sedgwick County jail down in Wichita. And at that, when I was a kid, he could take me into the jail and walk me along the catwalks and introduce me to guys. I don't think we'd probably get away with that today. But Dad made the point to me back then that people don't look any different than you necessarily, and Jim Tyrer was a good guy. So I'm not equating these two things, but my dad introduced me to a guy that looked like he could have been in a toothpaste commercial. Just friendly, shook my hand, nice as can be. And once we got on down the catwalk, he's told me how many people that guy had killed. And Dad's point was that it's not like in the movies where a guy wears a black cape and twists his mustache. You don't see if somebody's a good person, a bad person, what's going on inside their head by how handsome or pretty they are.
Or charming, because, if you talk to people who study the serial killers, we had on the show a while ago someone who's studied Ted Bundy. And, Joel, I think we might ask him back, this conversation. But he'll tell you about how charming Ted Bundy was. And part of his success was his ability to lure people in and believe he's just an innocent, friendly guy. And we see that in these serial killers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I really think somebody's actions are everything. Stop looking at whether they have a pressed shirt. That that means very little if you're trying to understand somebody. And Michael, I know you understand this much better than I do, but as years as a reporter, interacting with politicians and criminals and all walks of life.
There are different things there, Kevin, politicians and criminals.
So sometimes it's the same person.
Okay.
Tough crowd here. Yeah, tough crowd. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me ask you a quick question here, and I want you both to weigh in on this. But so we go back to this terrible night, and Jim Tyrer kills his wife, takes his own life. He is a superstar in Kansas City at that point. He's been, like you said yourself, he would have been a first-round Hall of Fame pick. He was every bit as big as the names we all kind of know from 50 years ago that we talked about in 1980. So this all happens. So when authorities arrive on the scene, I'm kind of curious, Michael, from your perspective as a law enforcement person, and then Kevin, what you may know about that night, what is the reaction when you come upon a scene, and this is somebody that and is, for lack of a better word, important in the community? Does it change perspective in terms of law enforcement or anything, Michael?
Well, from law enforcement, we get there, we realize it has to be handled as any other matter. But knowing what we know, knowing his notoriety, we'd have to worry about people like our guest who show up and want to interview, want that exclusive shot. And I'm not faulting it, Kevin. I'm really not. We all have a job to do. What makes it difficult for police is we cannot interfere with the freedom of the press. And so if we're talking to one of the victims being the family who survived, I consider them a victim, and we're out there in public and someone's focusing a camera on them, we can't go over there as law enforcement, put a hand over the camera and say, get out of here. We could establish a barrier and keep them out of the crime scene. We could ask the family, to think about maybe you don't want to go out there and talk to the press, but we can't really stop it. So it's a very delicate balance of trying to do your job, trying to respect the family's privacy, trying to, sort of get them not to do something they may regret later, though that's, something we can't control. And but the important thing is you have to do the crime scene. Is it a homicide? Is it a suicide? And what else? And you have to put together that case as if you're going to prosecute that person for a potential crime, meaning we have to have all the answers. So when something comes up later, we can't say, oh, it was suicide. We didn't look at that. Kevin, your perspective.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what it was like standing outside of homes, just like where this happened with Tyrer. It's interesting. You say that you worked in Fairfax. Well, I did too. I worked in DC.
What years were you there?
This would have been, let's go backward 6 years.
Oh, okay. Long after I was there.
Right.
Because otherwise I probably would have written you a ticket sometime in your stay there. I was one of those kind of cops, But anyway, I'm sorry.
But not so long ago, there was an ATF agent in a upper middle class neighborhood. It just mirrors what happened with Tyrer, and his kids were in the house. And I remember in the pre-dawn hours standing in front of that house and seeing in the dark there, seeing just the flash of light coming from the upper bedroom, just kind of, and that would happen periodically and light up just a little bit out in front of the house. And it clicked with me. They're taking photos inside the room there, and it gave me chills that you knew the significance of what you knew, the weight of what was going on there.
I have to ask,
what was the response to Tyrer in this town, Kevin, Patrick Allen? What was the response to this among the media and among everybody in this town when this happened to Jim Tyrer?
Here's one of the interesting things, Joel, is that I think people were just at a loss. They're trying to figure it out. If you read the articles back then, what really strikes me is that they're trying to come to a conclusion. They're trying to bring the answer to light when the answer won't fully be available for 25 years. So they're working on the assumption that the answer is there and we can provide it. And in some cases, what I see of the coverage from back then, they're making the mistake of coming to a conclusion that they don't know. So sure, he had financial difficulties and these other things are true, but what else? And they didn't know back then what the what else was. So there was one article that goes on maybe longer than it should have, where they're talking about manhood and spiraling. And okay, that's part of it. But don't try to tie a bow on something that you don't have all the answers for yet.
Well, Kevin, that interesting point, and playing upon Joel's question, when someone commits suicide, we think, what didn't we see? We feel bad for that person. They must have been struggling. I wish I could have been there. Or if it's someone we didn't know, but we knew through the media, we feel sorry for them and a lot of sympathy. However, in this case, he also committed murder. So did that, in the research you've done, sort of muddy the waters in terms of how he was remembered and how he was viewed?
Yeah, there's no question about it. The timing of the Hall of Fame vote shows that for you. So this murder happens in September of 1980. The Hall of Fame had condensed, had come up with a finalist for the Hall of Fame vote, which would be held in February. It was the first year that Tyrer was eligible. He is a finalist. And come February, when the vote is held, he doesn't make it. Mm-hmm. And not only does he not make it, he never again is a finalist. So if I've printed out every single person who was a finalist for the Hall of Fame, and we're talking about a long list. If you disappear from the list after 1 year as a finalist, that's because you got in that year. So Tyrer is this weird exception where, wow, he was a finalist the first year that he was eligible, and then we never see him again. I mean, you really can't say that, well, there are lots of other Chiefs on that team, and a lot of them made the Hall of Fame, or the AFL is regarded as not quite as strong, and he came from the AFL. Then why was he there the very first year that he was eligible, and then never again? It's clear that even though it says that this is about your on the field actions, that soured everybody on him.
Hey, Joel, I have a question for you. You have a lot of experience looking into the human soul from a different perspective that Kevin and I have. So when do you think the people, the average person looks at someone like Tyrer or anybody else who committed suicide but also committed murder, how do we view it? Do we view them as a murderer? Do we have the same sympathy we'd have if they hadn't? Do we say he was sick and unfortunately his victim was a victim of that illness? How do you think this is viewed?
I think that as a rule, I think that we probably look at that situation and we are horrified by the enormity of it, about what happened there. But I think as we think about it, I would think a lot of people say to themselves or to others, okay, I feel bad for the person who killed him or herself, but why did they do it to their children? Why did they do it to their spouse? Why did they go to their workplace? And because we hear about that too, where somebody will go to a workplace and shoot somebody that fired him or her, and then they shoot themselves. So you feel an initial sympathy, or at least you want to feel some sense of sympathy for the person who took their own life. But when it's compounded by the kind of collateral damage, I think then all of a sudden your perspective does start to change a little bit, and you wonder, why did they outwardly direct all of this anger, rage, sadness, or whatever, rather than themselves? Is there any sense, Kevin, about why he felt, I mean, this is I don't mean it to be insensitive, but why he felt he would take his wife's life and not his own, and not just his own? And I hate using the word just because it's a life, but you know what I'm saying here? What made him do exactly what Michael's referring to, and going that other step, taking someone else's life?
Well, I guess kind of where I go with it is, and we haven't talked about CTE and the head trauma very much, but one of the key traits of CTE is that explosivity and and imploding. And anyway, the way that I've come to understand CTE is, let's imagine you've got all these problems in your life. You've got, you're human. You're dealing with the same things that everybody else is dealing with, but you don't have the guardrail on your mental state anymore.
Kevin, can I just interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah.
Because it hasn't been in the news lately, can you explain to the audience what CTE is, and how it fits into this story? Yeah.
So it was discovered in I think 2002 that head trauma. I'll butcher the acronym CT, chronic encephalopathy, I think, but it was discovered in 2002 that consistent subconcussive head trauma can mess with your mental state, essentially, and that you do some things and physically you feel miserable. You do things that just aren't consistent with who you are. And so with Tyrer, that's why, people like myself have looked at the entirety of his life, and it's like this one night is not consistent with his whole life. And yes, he could have gotten mad at her about going to that interview the next morning, and that she was planning to look for a job. But the entirety of his life doesn't suggest that he would have responded the way he did that night, or that he'd ever responded in a manner that was anywhere close to that. So when you look at CTE, you see that the guardrails of a life aren't there anymore. So whereas imagine that night if he didn't have CTE, you have a big argument. And then 2 days later, things are back to normal. Hey, honey, you're right. It wouldn't hurt if you made some money on the side. This thing will turn around. We're going to be as resilient as we ever were. Or if you've got CTE and you get angry and it just continues to roll, and there is no guardrail for your emotions anymore. And you find yourself in the middle of something you just couldn't imagine that you ever would have done.
Have you looked at, or you're aware of any similarity here with Aaron Hernandez?
Yeah, I think Aaron Hernandez, because he's of the time, people have talked about him a lot. And the thing that I think is different with Aaron Hernandez is that if you look at Aaron Hernandez's life, he had a lot of problems, from like 12, 13 years old. He was going down a bad road for lots of reasons. Tyrer's is more just a deal where just one day, that's that. Mm-hmm. Now, there are indications that, for example, he had talked to his pastor like 3 days before. And not only had he expressed some of his difficulties, but some things just were odd. Like, I feel like all my teeth are coming out.
Mm-hmm. So I think on your website, and tell us your website real fast if people want to know more about the movie and support your movie, because you also are looking to raise some money to make it too.
That's right. It's goodmanmovie.com.
Okay. And at that website, I think there's a little line that says, life is more than its concluding event. In your talking to the family, these kids that have survived and according to you have thrived, to go back to Michael's question a little bit and twist it a bit, how do they look at the fact that, yes, their father killed himself, but their father also killed their mother? Do they look at his life in total and say this was that one weird night, terrible, tragic, weird night? Or how do they kind of comprehend that?
Yeah, they think very highly of their dad. And they really came to that conclusion pretty fast, which is major credit to them that they, even though they didn't have the answers right then, they still rallied as a family and said that even though we don't understand this, we're going to move forward, and we're going to do it in a way that doesn't disparage anybody, because it just wasn't Dad. It just was not who he was.
Sorry. Go ahead, Ken. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
one of the things that just blew me away, which speaks to the family's resilience, is that the oldest son, the 17-year-old who was in the house and kind of got his younger siblings together and got them downstairs after they knew what had happened. This crime happens on a Monday, funeral's on Wednesday. They have a reception back of the house. The 17-year-old son, Brad Tyrer, he goes into the backyard and sits on the back stoop and has his head in his hands and is just feeling really, feeling terrible. And he said that he felt a pop on the back of his head. It's like almost a physical pop on the back of his head. And it was God telling him, you had 17 years of great parents, so many blessings, get up, get moving. And he claims to this day, it's been 40 years now, that was the day he got over his folks' death.
That is kind of interesting. It leaves you a little bit of the chills when you hear it.
Yeah.
Joel and I had another interview with someone who was a survivor of suicide, another one of our shows, and so the impact left on that person's life. You mentioned earlier that when you spoke to, I think, the daughter, she said, my parents were in an accident. Do you think, was that some sort of coping mechanism having to do with the fact it was suicide, or again, maybe is it some sort of maybe shame? I'm not faulting the people that the dad also took their mom's life, or is that just the way they've sort of coped with it? What was your impression, or did they address that at all?
Yeah, I think maybe they're maybe more stoic than some people on average, but I found that maybe there's something to learn from that. And let me go back a little bit here. The people that came in to take care of the kids were the grandparents and did a wonderful job. And Grandpa only had one limb. And so when the kids mentioned this to me, I'm like, okay, hold up. There's something there. And well, Grandpa had been in a car wreck 1 week removed from college, having graduated, and 4 people were in the car, 3 burned to death. Grandpa survives and loses 3 limbs. And Grandpa had been in that same place where it's like, what do I have to offer? Where do I go forward? Do I not? And he just was resolved that I'm going to make something of my life. And so he was that example to those kids and to that family, but he wasn't really verbal about it. It didn't have to. I guess what I'm saying is these days we put a high value on communicating our feelings and being transparent and all these things, which is great. But I think the grandpa put a higher value on, we don't have to talk forever about this. Let's focus more on moving forward. And I wonder, when I see these kids, they work through things in their head, but not ad nauseum. It's like, okay, we're going to reach a conclusion. And once we've done the best we can with what we've figured out, it's time to move forward. And so I admire them for that. They don't talk a lot, but they're very big on actions.
Kevin, I doubt there's anything you got into just because, but often in this situation, men are guilty of familicide, where they kill the entire family before they kill themselves. And they have their own reasons for whatever we could deduce. Obviously, if they committed suicide, we don't know. But it's a belief that they believe that they're bringing this, sparing the family, saving the family. Because here again, he didn't just take his own life. He took his wife's life. We don't believe any animosity. Do you have any guess, or has any of your research indicated why he didn't, take his children out at the same time he killed his wife? I mean, obviously we're grateful he didn't, but just given the pattern that we've seen in these mass or these murder-suicides, it kind of raises the question.
Right. That's an awesome question, because I have thought about that. And I remember being out on a murder-suicide, or what was intended to be one, where a mom wraps her arms around her 5-year-old son and jumped in front of a train. The boy actually survived, and the mom did not. And I remember interviewing somebody at the time about why in the world would you take the kid? And the expert at the time said, well, you're wanting to take the best part of you with you. You're wanting to protect them. They're, went through all these explanations. So I wondered with Tyrer, well, why wouldn't he have done that as well? And as near as I can tell, that, well, the motive was different. It wasn't a planned thing to gather everybody up and go to a better place, or any of these things that get going in somebody's head. It really was that more explosive moment of not considering what you're doing, of, like I said, not having the guardrails on your emotions. And I think about the few seconds between when he killed her and kids said that they could hear clump, 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 him walking around, and then this primeval scream. I think those seconds tell you that he realizes he's at a point of no return. He's done what he's done, and he's going to end it for himself as well. That, yeah, there's no indication he ever thought about taking them, that he planned anything out. And so I think the motivation was just different than those cases you talk about.
Well, that would lead to an interesting question that I'm pretty confident Joel is thinking about too right now. Obviously, he had immediate access to a weapon, right? He didn't plan to go out and buy one, right? It was in the house. He had this explosive moment. In your opinion, Kevin, just based on what you read, just based on your experience as a journalist, and this is not a Second Amendment debate, nothing like that.
Yeah.
But just, do you think possibly if he didn't have immediate access to a weapon, this may not have happened?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, you think of any other way that you would take a life in a split second. There's a mental process that goes on with other ways of killing somebody, right? I mean, you think of, I've covered cases where somebody's strangled, and you think of holding your hands on somebody's throat for a period of time. I mean, it doesn't happen in 5 seconds. There's more of a mental thought process that goes into that. And for me, I've always thought that that's more of an indication of the character of the individual, and that they need to go away for a longer period of time. It's not a slip.
Right. So, you wonder if he was going through that motion, or even a knife, again, where it's up close, it's
right.
very personal. And again, none of us are, have the medical background to understand CTE, but you just wonder, would there be perhaps a moment of clarity?
Right.
Even in all that rage, as to, ooh, look what I am doing and I need to stop.
Right.
Well, and like you said, Kevin, the time he stopped, he apparently walked around those seconds after he had killed his wife. Maybe he was starting to regain some clarity, and that's just enough clarity to know, what have I done? And all I have left is to do what I'm about to do. So, I mean, he may have come back for just long enough to know what he had done and feel this enormous remorse and regret, and did, like you said, decided that it's a point of no return.
Right. Well, one of the kids described it as a primeval scream right at the moment that he, takes his own life. Why do you scream like that?
Right. Hey, how did the Chiefs react as an organization when this happened in 1980? And I'm sure that you've spoken to a lot of the Chiefs from that time, but is there any kind of reaction or comment from them about this horrific story of one of their greats?
They say one of the keys to resilience is that you have people around that believe in you. Those kids had that. They remember Lamar Hunt being in their living room with his wife. I mean, that says a lot.
You bet.
And the eldest son, for example, so the crime happens on Monday, the funeral is on Wednesday. He went to football practice for Rockhurst on Thursday. And the team gathered out there and waited for him to trot onto the field. And they were instructed, we are going to support this young man. And the next day, he's in the game. And they put him in he played both sides of the ball. They put him in to kick a field goal that was important to the outcome of that game.
Wow.
So anyway, from Fred Arbanis, who was a tight end at the time, to Ed Lothamer, to Ed Buddy, to the Hunts, to Rockhurst High School, Barstow School, those kids have no memory of anyone saying you're damaged goods. The whole community really did a great job.
Joel, I know what motivated that question, and I know what you're thinking. And, you know, Kevin, as I mentioned, we interviewed on another show a survivor of suicide. And the person who committed suicide also professionally was part of what you would think was a very close-knit family, and that you think the response would be similar to what you just described, but it was a different case. And it's going to be a very interesting juxtaposition, Joel, I think, of the two shows. And you know, and the responses from those that you thought you'd have your support group come. So that's kind of interesting. And maybe support for people who are victims of suicide, meaning, you know, the survivors. Maybe that's a show in of itself that we need to talk about. Kevin, we're running up on time, and this has been a fascinating, you know, topic, a fascinating story. One more time, tell us about your show, your webpage, anything else you're working on, any works you have out there that you'd like to tell the audience about.
Yeah, believe it or not, we've scratched the surface of what this family can tell us. You know, I mentioned to you the grandparents and the grandpa that only had one limb, and the kids are 40 years removed from this and the things that they've done in their lives. And so with this documentary, naturally, I've had some people say to me, including old Chiefs teammates, why go back there? Why do this? Because it didn't end there. There's this old saying that everything looks like a failure in the middle. It wasn't a failure. I mean, it was a terrible day, and people were very sad about it and continue to be. But wow, they built something out of that, and they wouldn't have got through it if you know, Grandpa had thrown in the towel himself when he went through his own tragedy. So it's goodmanmovie.com. And I think that it really has the power to, for example, show this current generation that has very high suicide rates.
Yes, epidemic-wise.
Yeah, here are some of the keys to being resilient. Here are people who have been resilient. Here's how they did it. Here's how they were grateful for the lives that they had amid tragedy. And I will tell you guys that storytelling is my skill set. Fundraising is not. But to tell a good story, you've got to have the funds to do it. So, you know, if this resonates with a corporate sponsor that they have a similar mission, or if somebody just wants to give $5, I've got a donation link on goodmanmovie.com. And we think it'll take about $75,000 to go to all these locations and to do this right. And in the past couple of weeks, we've raised $8,000. So we're getting there, but we're going to have to be intentional about it to make it happen.
Before we let you go, you've got the other documentary that people should look for so they know the quality of your work. I know the quality of your work because I've known you a long time. You've always been a great reporter. You've always told great stories. You've always looked at stories within the context of society, which is not something all reporters do. But you have another documentary, and we're going to run out of time, but it's called What Comes Next? And can people still find that? Because I watched it on Amazon Prime, I think is where I watched it. Can people still find What Comes Next? Yeah,
it's on Amazon Prime. What Comes Next? And you'll see an X Games cyclist flying through the air. That's kind of the poster for it there.
Yeah. If people want to know about your work, find that wonderful documentary, What Comes Next, and then they're going to want to support telling this story too.
Hey, one last thing. Have you seen my son?
No, I have not lately. Here's what that story's about, Mr. Tabman.
Yes.
I was hosting a run out in Olathe, I believe it was, and this little boy this is years ago, little boy comes up to me and says, I don't know where my dad is. And so I took him up on stage and I said, this young man is looking for his dad, and here comes Kevin Patrick Allen, who had been out running and had done his thing, but had kind of lost sight of this young man who is now a fine runner in his own right. So I keep track of all of Kevin Patrick Allen's children when it is my responsibility to do so.
And it's good to have someone do that. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kevin.
And the reason why that terrified me so much was not so much my son's well-being, but I knew Joel would talk about that on the air the next morning.
And I did.
We love to have our little failures highlighted. Before I let you go, Kevin, two things I want to mention. One is, do you remember a movie on CTE many years ago? I think Will Smith starred as a doctor.
Right.
Do you remember the name of it? I don't.
Concussion.
What was it called?
Concussion.
I would recommend, if people are interested in this topic, to watch that film. I thought it was a great film. Opened up my eyes to the story. But I just want to address one thing. You said people have asked you why bring this story up. You know, it's the past. Well, you're not bringing it up to torture anybody, to bring up bad memories. History tells us a story. That's why it's called history. There's a lesson there. And I think you're teaching us a very important lesson. There's a lot of important matters that you're bringing up in this story. And I think, you know, it's the right thing to do. And, you know, no one should question your motivation on that. It's a good story, and I look forward to seeing that documentary come to us.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Joel, any last thoughts before we sign off?
I would just urge everybody to go watch What Comes Next on Amazon Prime, Kevin's other documentary. There are a lot of amazing stories there, and it'll make you want to get behind this story as well. And Kevin Patrick Allen, it's always good to see you with or without your son.
You too.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Joel. And thank you, everybody, for watching tonight. Please join us next week on another episode of Crimes and Times.